Welcome to Tipsverse. Today I'll be covering a very important topic on fiction writing, and it is all about the fantasy world building strategy. Building a fantasy world that seems real to the readers should be the ultimate motive of an author. Authors must take the readers on a roller coaster ride by defining the fantasy in exactly the same way the authors feel about the adventure and drama while writing their story. Fantasy worlds are created in our minds every now and then. And while traveling, while working on a computer or laptop, or even playing outdoor games or video games. Basically, if you want to write a fantasy book, use your power of imagination and willpower to live in your own imaginary world, and that will give rise to a fictional world you were trying to create for your novel. Don't just dream of wizards, elves, hobbits to write a fantasy story. If you dream of those, you cannot come up with your own inventive, innovative creatures. Readers want to know new stuff, and that's why you gotta believe in your creativity. Forget about the books you've already read and the movies you have already seen. Your mind and imagination will create you the imaginary fantasy world which you have not seen or heard before. You can use the following methods as a guide or template to devise your own fantasy world that will be liked by your audience and the readers. Number 1. Draw a map. The basic backbone of fantasy world building is drawing a map. Drawing a map gives you a vision to create your own fantasy world where you're gonna put life to your landscape and characters. The map is not to be displayed to your readers. This is for your own goal to define every element required to build and design your fantasy world. Your map will show you the path where your characters' elements go throughout your novel. This is absolutely necessary when you are drafting an epic novel consisting of transformations in life, culture, and land. You can also create a map to portray different landscapes, hierarchical kingdoms, relationship between characters, objects, and their supernatural abilities if they have any, wars, battles in course of your fantasy novel. Then you can use this map to draft your novel. Number 2. Start with place and time. The setup can be fantastical world or a futuristic world or post-apocalyptic world. It depends what your story is all about. It is imperative for the reader to know whether the story is all about the past, present, or future. Thus, history of the place and time is very important in drafting the fantasy world building you are going to create for your novel. Number 3. Defining laws and rules for your fantasy world building. You might find this odd as the genre is fantasy. So why implementing rules? It's like we can write fantasy what we feel without mentioning any rules. The world you create, for example fantasy or magical, you gotta define rules, just like a science fiction story. The rules protocols defined in your fictional world should resonate and must be clear and comprehensible to the readers in every sense. Your fantasy world can be based on historic events of medieval age. It can be a reference from a Byzantine civilization, age of Renaissance, Mesopotamian civilization, Harappan civilization, Mohenjo-daro, American folklore, or some urban legends. You can also create a complete new abstract world out of your imagination. Whatever approach you are undertaking, it must be properly explained to your audience. If your fantasy world is based on super advanced technology or an obsolete technology, a holistic and detailed explanation of working principles of the technology is must for all your fantasy stories. Don't write superficial explanation that just gives confusion to the readers. Whether it's a scientific or fantasy, explanation of terms and jargons and rules in your story should be properly defined in your novel. Now, characters in fantasy world building. Fantasy world is full of interesting and amazing characters. What is the species in your story? Are they humans, aliens, zombies, animals, beasts, demons, monsters, mutants? How do they communicate? Does the animals communicate to the humans? How do they get along? Food habits of the inhabitants, lifestyle. You can ask yourself the following related questions. And the lifestyle of your characters. Where do they stay? Do they stay in houses, mansions, tents, forests, deserts, islands? Are they nomads? Do they live in cities or villages? Does the animals communicate with the humans? And how well they get along with each other? Define magic. Every fantasy world is defined by magic and fantasy stuff without which your novel is incomplete. In fact, magical power is the first thing that comes to your mind as a fantasy reader. Thus, elements of magic are almost indispensable requirements for a fantasy novel. But magic can be anything. You must define magic clearly to the audience. Before defining magic in your story, you must ask yourself the following questions as an author. How different is your fantasy novel magic from the real world magic? Is the magic inherited or acquired? If acquired, what is the source of magic? What are the limitations as well as the power of magic? What is the longevity of the magic? Now, culture. These questions you must ask yourself if you want to incorporate the presence of culture in your story. We all know cultures differ from place to place. Even same place might have different cultures in the historical progress. People living in cities have different cultures to those living in villages. People living in mountains have completely different set of lifestyles to those living in plateau or valley regions. Your fantasy novel might contain these different cultures, and the tribes and people coming from them might travel to distant land. Tolkien, as you know, a master in drafting these geographical cultural differences that crossed over 1,000 years in Middle Earth history to modern age. There can be conflict with different cultural tribes. The character might need to travel to different land and get accustomed to new culture. There may be a rift between the kingdoms of different culture, and there are so many options with which you can build your fantasy world based on the cultural differences. Thrill in fantasy world building. The readers must feel and experience the fantasy world in the same way they experience in the real world by the sense of touch, taste, noise, and music. Your world must be believable and deserves attention in the backstory, arc, and motivation. Creating in-depth sketch like laws of government, everyday life of the citizens, their relationship, dealing with animals and other species. Adding these small stuffs hooks the reader to your story. Modes of transportation. What modes of transportation exist in your fantasy world? Are the following modes available? Flying cars, elephants, horses, boats, or any kind of custom rides? You can create all of these by your imagination and come up with many transportation rides along with new concepts. There is no mandate to use all the above mentioned points in your fantasy world building strategy. As an author, you are entitled to create the fantasy world in your own way. The above rules are just to give you a roadmap in building your story. You absolutely don't need to put every element to define your world. Fantasy world building can also be done in a simple way if your mind is brainstorming multiple complex ideas. For example, if your story is a post-apocalyptic one, there is nothing much to describe the world, although you can describe with few elements to define the post-apocalyptic world. If you like my video, don't forget to subscribe my channel, as you'll be getting all kinds of videos related to writing and motivation. See you in the next video.